I write for the field holler, the shout, the growl, the singer, the signer, and the signified. I write for the sinned against and the sanctifying. I write for the ones who clean the toilets and till the soil and walk the picket lines. For the hungry, the caged, the disregarded, the holding on. I write for you. I write because I love singing.
I took my children to see the Harriet Tubman movie, and there's this moment when her sisters are being sold down to Alabama, and everyone is crying, and it's crisis. It's a heart-wrenching scene, and I turned to my children and I said, "That's where we're from. The place that's striking terror in the hearts of those women is where we're from."
In order to fully understand what this place is and hopefully make it something closer to fair and just and kind to everybody who participates in it, I think we have to acknowledge that's us. Mm-hmm. It's not some other place. That's us.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Robert Samuels, National Enterprise reporter at the Post and co-author of His Name is George Floyd, One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice. Today, we continue our Race in America series with National Book Award winner Imani Perry, author of South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. Imani, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
I thank you for having me. I'm delighted to see you again.
I know, it's such a thrill to see you again. Last time it was such a pressure cooker.
It was.
Could you talk to us a little bit about how it feels to have this honor bestowed on you?
It's a bit surreal. I think that, those 2 days that we spent in New York, in many ways made it feel like something that I could get a little bit of a hold of, which is we were in a community of extraordinary writers and thinkers and people who are trying to bear witness with their work, including you and your extraordinary book. And so it feels wonderful. It also feels part of a sense of purpose I have, and yet I sort of can't believe it.
Yeah, I mean, we're so thrilled for you. The book is gorgeous, and I'm glad we got the chance to chat about it. In the beginning, you write that there isn't one beginning to the United States. It's a very profound statement. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about why you decided to begin in the South in thinking about your journey in understanding the United States.
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting because we're in the midst of these political debates about how you name the origin of the country, right? Whether you talk about 1619, 1620. For me, if you want to include Florida, you're going back to, 1500, 1776. And the debates about when we began are often connected to ideas about what is important, what parts of the story of the nation are important. I think one of the things that's really telling is wherever you begin the story, it is in the South. And part of that that as an origin point tells you a lot about what the country is, right? It began as this place where European empires that are hungry for expansion and in competition with each other and seeking the fountain of youth or gold or prosperity in some way or another descend upon this land where there are people already and decide to use it and to be willing to harness the land or have the greed for harnessing the land to be so intense that they're willing to push people off of it and grind other folks' lives down to almost nothing and really be sort of motivated by a desire to conquer. And that happened in the South because of the climate, right, and the environment, the lushness, the beauty. But that sensibility is really at the core of what this country has been. There's a fundamental tension between the sort of the starry-eyed dreaming and the cruelty that was at the inception point. And that's, part of, so I want to get at that as an origin point to understand why we are the way we are and in what ways we might aspire to be different.
Right. And one of the really interesting things about this is, as a person who grew up in the North, there's sort of this nefarious, we don't want to talk about the South idea that permeates our culture. Your book sort of challenges that notion. Talk a little bit about how you hold both the pleasure of it and the cruelty of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, part of it is for me, being born in the South, having my family be in the South, and growing up in the Northeast, and being in this, constant move back and forth over the course of my life, made me very aware of how mythologized the South was as the sort of the bad place down there, right? When, of course, and particularly around issues of race and racism, when, of course, the entire nation bears that shame. That so much of the mischaracterization in some ways functioned to absolve the rest of the country for its responsibility when it comes to inequality. And so I wanted to expose not just that, the story of inequality is not just a Southern story, but that the whole nation has sort of taken from the resources and the bounty of the South and participated in the ways that it has been a place of exploitation, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to understand it as a place of extraordinary beauty and freedom dreams. It's the poorest region, it's the region where people have the lowest life expectancy, it's a region where people are most vulnerable. It's also the region that is the heart of American music. It's the region where the deepest freedom dreams of this country have grown. There's incredible abundance that comes from people who are vulnerable, hoping for something better. And so that to me has always been a resource wherever I've gone, the tradition, the culture. And I thought it was really important to identify that as well.
Could you talk a little bit about what you learned? One, how your personal experiences as a person from Alabama, as you would say, Alabama influenced
Yeah.
what you were looking for, and also what you learned along the journey that surprised you.
Yeah, such a good question. I certainly learned in a way that I didn't fully grasp before that there are Souths plural. So, Alabamians, or Alabamans, as I say, but the more conventional term is Alabamians, are tend to really think about the South as the Deep South, so Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and it was actually a trip to Maryland where I was talking to a docent who described Maryland as a place, Annapolis, Maryland, as the urban South, and I thought, oh. Right. There is this history of the South being created in waves of people moving up and people moving down, and that the distinctions between the different parts of the South had everything to do with what crops were raised there, which people came to that location, and what the environment would bear. And so for me, sort of seeing the South in places, I had a kind of deep South bigotry towards, including someplace like DC, was really instructive, and allowed me to expand my understanding. And I think, what surprised me, I, I don't know that I was prepared for how profoundly emotional so many of my interactions were going to be. My interactions with strangers. The book has lots of encounters with people that I found, deeply moving and transformative. Strangers, even, and some of them became dear friends in the process. And so it was a life transforming book, as these things go, as well as a book that I was really eager to share with the world.
Can you tell us more about some of those interactions and transformations that happened?
Yeah, one of the stories that I love and tell is about a woman I met who in Virginia, but she was from North Carolina, and she talked about um, having lost everything in a divorce, and then finding that she had the power to heal, right? So she found Jesus, and she found she had the power to heal, and she was talked about sneaking into hospitals to heal people. And there was something, and so the story has a little bit, it's sort of funny, but it also revealed a lot about how and why faith is so important in the South. And part of it has to do with the depth of people's vulnerability. And the desire to heal actually said something about also the sense of sort of networking and intimacy. And at the same time, I suspected that she and I had very different politics and values. And so it was one of these moments where I could see where we came together and we diverged in the same moment. And those were really profound. I also became friends with Dr. Walter Evans, who is a man in Savannah, who is the person who possessed the personal papers and family photo albums of Frederick Douglass that actually led to David Blythe's magisterial biography of Frederick Douglass. He also is a person who had letters of Malcolm X that the extraordinary recent biography of Malcolm X depended on from Les Payne. And so he's this person who's this kind of font of information that all these books come through with this extraordinary home in Savannah, he and his wife. And so they became friends in the process. So there's so much.
It's amazing because so much of the book, it feels to be about connection and memory. And we were talking a little bit about this. The idea that when you're speaking, was she a cab driver?
Yeah.
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 The idea of being able to connect with folks and create a new narrative, for her, it in so many ways was also what you are doing in terms of your research and your journey. And that was really interesting to see. One of those connection points, it happens to be the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you think the significance is of having that kind of memorial in Montgomery.
Um, it is so profound. Um, and there's a couple of things about where it's situated in Montgomery that I think are significant. It is, it's one exit away from the Confederate Museum. It's around the corner from the Hank Williams Museum. Um, and it's cat a corner to a parole office. And so it's situated in this place that and of course, Montgomery was one of the capitals of the Confederacy. So it's situated physically in this space where not only the history of slavery and the relationship between that and the history of mass incarceration is very clear, but part of what Brian Stevenson has done is to re-narrate the space by putting the memorial at the center of it, and it has, and it's a word-filled memorial. It has the names of all of these victims of lynching, but it also has quotations from Toni Morrison and Elizabeth Alexander, and so we are filled with a kind of reverential memory of people, but also words that recast the story and tell the story of Alabama not as a story that is triumphant from the perspective of the Confederacy, but as the story of a great deal of heartbreak and devastation, but also resilience and the possibility of struggling for justice. And so, which is, what brought Stevenson to Alabama. So it's a really an important place.
Right. And when we're on that topic, you're right that as an American, I'm expected to digest the founding fathers' venom casually as though it is merely a part of the nation's genealogy, but not its soul. What do you think is the honest assessment of what our founding fathers are and the honest assessment of the South?
Um, I think an honest assessment of the founding fathers requires us to say that the world that they were made by and the image in which they were made was based upon an idea that only a few ought to be recognized as fully human and fully possessed of rights, and that shaped all doing. Who would be recognized fully as a legal person, who would be recognized as a citizen, who could hold property, who performed labor and who reaped the benefits of the labor. And so I think we have to tell that story honestly and then be critical about, which doesn't mean throwing away everything they said or did, but be critical. Understanding the constraints of the world out of which they came means that we need to have a critical gaze with respect to the institutions and the perspectives that they had. And so, we shouldn't. I don't believe in a kind of reverential patriotism. I think that we should be critical about ourselves, and we should be critical about our genealogy, and we should be honest, because we aspire to use history to create a world that's fit for everyone to live in and flourish. So, um, yeah, I don't like the lionization of founding fathers or anyone, or a lionized patriotism. Love of country requires, I think, brutal honesty.
It's so interesting because I feel that tension, I mean, it surrounds so many of the things that I'm interested in. But, through your research and through what you've done, what do you think the assessment is about why is it so hard for us as a country to have that critical assessment and also fear that if we have that critical assessment, we cannot have a sense of reverence for the past.
Right. I mean, I think part of it is that Americans are really addicted to innocence. For some reason, we think being innocent is virtuous. And so if we claim innocence, that we're somehow better. And I think that's a kind of adolescent relationship to history and observation about the world, that we need to grow up and be transparent about who and what we are and the ways in which we're all implicated, most of us, in some forms of injustice. And so, it requires a shift in culture. I think there's another piece, which is we feel the pressure of highly competitive society at all times. And so people want to hoard whatever little benefits they have, which gets in the way of actually investing in what would be good for all, right? So on multiple registers, whether it is being honest about who we are, whether it is actually believing in that interdependence is really essential, we have to do some transformation in order to, I think, to get to better history, frankly.
Mm. Uh, Um, could you talk to us a little
Mhm.
bit about Shield Screen? Because I think
Yeah.
it's a really fascinating story. Uh, what did you learn about him, and what do you want readers to take away from his story?
Oh, I want people. So Shields Green was this man who went by the name the Emperor of New York. He was involved in John Brown's raid. It was a black man who was described in really kind of ugly terms, as very African, um, and it was someone who had a speech impediment, and also someone who clearly was passionate, convicted, and charismatic. Frederick Douglass admired him, and he died in John Brown's raid. He was executed in the aftermath, and his remains were desecrated. Um, And part of what I think is so important about including stories like his is that he wasn't literate. So we don't have his words. And so part of what we need to do in the telling of history is actually consider the stories or try to catch a hold of a likeness of the stories that may not come directly from someone but are actually really part of, of the fabric of the nation, right? And so I wanted to include him and also include what we don't know about him as being relevant to who we take ourselves to be. Our sites of ignorance, right, are critical just as our sites of knowledge are. Oh yeah, extraordinary
Right.
story.
Right. It's that virtuous innocence, right?
Yeah.
Sort of the idea that if we don't have a verbal record of it or an oral record of it, we can sort of pass it by or think of it as something that's not completely relevant. Uh, so much of the book thinks about the way stories are interpreted and the way stories are translated. There are parts of the book when you talk about what you learned from your grandmother and what you learned from your parents about understanding the role of the South and the country. We talked a little bit about that interesting interlude. I think it's one of the most interesting parts of the book about your son and his assessment of the Confederate flag debates.
Hmm.
And when you see those two things interspersed in between your journey and understanding the soul of the country, you really get to see how different generations see this country differently. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what strikes you about the way those different generations in your own family uh, have changed when thinking about the perceptions of the country and how those differences reflect on you in terms of how you think about the country.
Yeah, it's such a great question because we tend to, I think, we run the risk of sort of thinking of ourselves as always moving in a linear forward narrative. And in so many ways, I think my children are confronting, as children are confronting sort of the ugliest parts of American history in a much more direct way than I did, even though I was, a movement baby, in part because of the rise of white nationalism and replacement theory um, and militias and all of these groups that are very present in their lives in ways that mine weren't, and in some ways, in ways that they weren't present in my life, and in some ways, there's a likeness between my mother having come of age under the white nationalism of Jim Crow Alabama, and my children coming of age and partially in the age of Trump. Um, I also think there's these generational shifts that have to do with um, proximity to the land in my own family, proximity to so my grandmother, who really was on the land where her ancestors had been enslaved. That's the context she came of age. That sort of sense of, and I have tried to replicate um, the sense of ritual, the sense of reverence that comes from that. There's a kind of spiritual tending that I think is part of people who come of age knowing what happened ancestrally that I have tried to replicate, but of course it's in a different way. As someone who is urban and was born in the urban South, and it for me it manifests in how attending to stories, tending to the tradition, tending to the legacy of the writers who shaped me, and the thinkers, and the organizers, and the activists. And so, the idea of home. Um, Registers distinctly in each generation. What I think is fascinating, though, is that for all of us, home stays the same place in a sense, right? So we're disparate. We're far flung, but Alabama has maintained a hold on the hearts of the multiple generations of my family, notwithstanding the ugliness of its history.
We're coming close to the end here. but I want to talk a little bit about just that filled, thorough speech that you gave the last time we saw each other. And you said, I write because I love sentences and I love freedom more. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what do you think the connection is between sentences and freedom?
So I think about David Walker's Appeal, right? That was published in 1829, that was sent through the South under cover of night, that was a, a call to arms for freedom. And people were risking their lives by listening to it, steal away meetings, enslaved people stealing away to hear Walker's appeal. And the idea of, or I think of, Frederick Douglass's narrative that we come from a tradition in which sentences have been used to ignite the imagination towards freedom dreams. And that's in the literary sense, but of course also in a musical sense, right? The blues, the wail, the holler, right? That in the field, but also in the blues song, but also in my favorite song by the Commodores, Zoom. These that words perform, I think, a kind of spiritual alchemy that is actually connected to imagining freedom. Um, and that's why I think those of us who cleave so tightly to them, right, do so, and why it's so the work, I think, is so meaningful. It's not just it's not just a mechanical undertaking. It is, I think, for many of us, I know, certainly for both of us, it's about doing something meaningful and good and true. And so, yeah, they're highly connected.
What's the next question that fascinates you as you look toward your next project?
Oh, yeah. So the next project is about the color blue, and in Black life. I am working on it on a daily basis, but the question that is really underneath it, and is part of why I'm thinking so much about the color blue, um, is about color and race, and how it was that Black people became Black, in the sense of that having a meaning, as opposed to all of um, the various ethnicities and nations of the African continent, and all of the various ways that we have national identities. How did they become Black? Not just as something that was placed upon us, but as something that we made meaning out of. Um, and I think the color blue is helping me figure that out. So.
We cannot wait to see what you say about the color blue as opposed to the color purple, which is so visible on your screen today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So we will have to leave it there. Thank you, Imani, so much for this. Congratulations again. And thank you for speaking with me. And thanks to all of you for joining us. To find out what interviews we have coming up, head to WashingtonPostLive.com. I'm Robert Samuels, and thank you again for watching. Have a wonderful day.